Label Machine Podcast. This podcast is a locomotive and it's not stopping anytime soon. Today, I have on a very special guest. I have on Sarah George, who is a state's attorney from Vermont. Sarah George, how is it going?
Hello, Kim. It's going well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you. So I think the biggest thing for a huge percentage of our population is that me included, have very little idea what a state's attorney actually does. So if you could please just be our teacher for 1 second and tell us sort of some of your job duties, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Vermont, we are called state's attorneys, but in most other jurisdictions, we're called district attorneys. So it's the same exact thing as a district attorney. In Vermont, we have a state's attorney elected in each county. So we have 14 counties in Vermont. We have 14 elected state's attorneys. And each of us are responsible for all of the criminal prosecution of crimes that happen within our county. So for me, I'm the state's attorney in Chittenden County, which is in Burlington, Vermont. It holds about a third of our state's population. It's by far the largest county in Vermont. And that means that my office is responsible for the prosecution of all of the criminal acts that happen within Chittenden County.
Amazing. So with this sort of county that you operate within, I know that, correct me if I'm wrong, the University of Vermont is there.
Yep.
And that Burlington is where Bernie Sanders called home. What are,
That's right.
during your job duties, what are some of the cases that you run into? What is the gambit?
Yeah, it's everything. You're right. So we have the University of Vermont. We also have Champlain College. We have St. Michael's College. So we have a large population of college students. We are the home of Bernie Sanders. He actually lives currently in Burlington, Vermont, so he's a constituent. We're also the home of Ben and Jerry's for ice cream lovers and social justice lovers. We do everything. I mean, we are a large population, and Burlington is certainly the largest city of our state. We're the most diverse county in the state. We have everything from disorderly conducts and unlawful mischiefs up to, unfortunately, homicides. Luckily, Vermont averages around 5 to 7 homicides a year statewide. So, we luckily only have a couple homicides a year, if any, but we certainly have a rising amount of gun violence happening in our community right now. So that's taking a lot of our time. And other than that, driving under the influence cases and bar fights and, everything in between.
Right. Is there anything particular about the gun laws in Vermont that you maybe wouldn't find in other states that sort of lead to maybe gun violence?
Interestingly, I think what you find in Vermont is the lack of gun laws. We have the fewest gun laws of anywhere else in the country. Up until a few years ago, we had no gun laws, really. Our current governor passed a slate of some gun laws that, conservatives were certainly against, but liberals would probably say really don't do a whole lot. But they are the first that we've ever had. That being said, we also have the lowest, or one of the lowest, gun violence records in the country. So I wouldn't say that our lack of gun laws necessarily correlates to our recent gun violence, because most of the guns that have been involved in those are like stolen from folks' cars. And so, particular gun laws might not impact that. But we do have a high amount of suicides by firearm. And so we are working with the legislature around some of those mental health issues as they relate to gun violence, mostly around suicides. But in general, our gun laws, or our lack of gun laws, I don't think have a direct correlation to our particular gun violence that's happening right now.
Okay. And so you said that your office is working with other offices to look at this sort of mental health services that could help people related to gun violence, gun violences by suicides and things like that. To me, that seems sort of different. I'd never really thought that was maybe in the purview of a district attorney. Can you kind of tell me about how sort of mental health plays into what you do specifically? And are you an aberration in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that my job as the Chittenden County State's Attorney, my priority is public safety, and that means the safety of everybody in my community, and that means people who are inflicting harm on others, but it also does mean people who are potentially inflicting harm on themselves. And it's mental health and criminal behavior go hand in hand often. A lot of people who aren't receiving adequate mental health care will end up committing a lot. Not everybody, of course, but will end up either committing crimes or potential harm on themselves. We are working on things like extreme risk protection orders, which will, when somebody is a threat to themselves or others, we can remove firearms from their possession, at least temporarily, while this particular risk is ongoing. That's certainly the purview of state's attorneys, because those firearms could, of course, be used to hurt themselves, but like I said, could also be used to hurt other people. I think an ERPO, an extreme risk protection order, in some of the school shootings we've seen around the country could have prevented what we ultimately saw. So, of course, those are all in the purview of the state's attorney. And also, I view my job as a public safety officer to be harm reduction in every way. So whether that is harm reduction as it relates to drug use, or harm reduction as it relates to the use of firearms on people or others. So I think whether it's an aberration, I don't think so. I think that it should at least be the purview of state's attorneys and district attorneys. It is certainly something I pay close attention to, because I get the autopsies of everybody who dies in my county, and I'm pretty sick of seeing suicide by firearm come through. And I think that there's probably stuff we could be doing to prevent it.
Amazing. How did you sort of, in your process of coming to your conclusions about the specific values that you want to carry into your job as a district attorney, what sort of experiences in your life and maybe your education led to some of the opinions that you form on public health and things like that?
Um, I think to start, I went to graduate school to get my master's degree in forensic psychology. And I did that because I wanted to become, at the time, a behavioral analyst for the FBI. I've always been really fascinated by why people do the things that they do, that being criminal behavior in some cases, or just regular human nature. It's always been something I was interested in. And then through my graduate work, I sort of discovered the criminal legal system in a way that I hadn't really recognized before, and really the injustices in our system, the really like systemic racism and classism, and decided to go to law school to try to undo some of that, to sort of re-examine our legal system and determine ways, or find ways, that prosecutors could actually be a part of the solution instead of a part of the problem. And from my perspective, that means more harm reduction approaches, less sort of law and order, or less like arresting and prosecuting our way out of things, and instead really examining other ways that we can be addressing the underlying issues that lead people to commit crimes, like true preventative and truly harm reduction work. I think it's really just been in my practice as an attorney, seeing all of the ways and all the things we're doing that don't work, and trying to figure out ways that actually do. While being really honest about the fact that our legal system was built on a foundation of racism, especially, but also classism, and figuring out ways that we can try to not just reform that, but like actually dismantle it.
Right. So it definitely seems as if you went into law school and your work having a deep motivation to do so, and sort of a purpose behind that.
Yeah.
I always thought, maybe in my mind, that the ideal with a lot of students that go into law school is to, have a big purpose behind what they do. But maybe perhaps more often than not, you see plenty of people that go into law because perhaps they think it could lead to a lot of money, or perhaps their parents wanted them to do that. So I think it's definitely quite interesting that you sort of have this background before law school that you use to propel and motivate your work.
Yeah, and definitely wasn't money. That's for sure. I became a prosecutor straight out of law school and had about $150,000 in student loan debt, and my starting salary was $38,000 a year. So I was working as a waitress on weekends, making far more money in one weekend than I was making all week as an attorney. Um, just recently hit my sort of 10 years for public service loan forgiveness. And so even as a state's attorney, I was working 3 jobs to pay my student loans. But I think that most people get into this work, specifically public service work, prosecution, or public defense, because they really care about it. Whether it's always for the right reasons or not, or whether they are actually caring about it in a way that is data driven or evidence based is questionable. But regardless, I think most folks get into this public service work because they want to make a difference and not because they care about the money. So
Right.
they'd be going in the wrong field, if not necessarily wrong field, but certainly the wrong practice if they were interested in the money.
Right. Sort of a stereotype of the legal system that I think of is the relationship between prosecutors and perhaps public defenders. And I guess the idea in the media sometimes is that maybe public defenders, if anything, are they have the image of being the ones that are the heroines that are motivated by trying to do right for the world and don't care about the money and stuff. Could you speak to sort of the relationship that you as a state's attorney has with public defenders? Is that an adversarial relationship? That's something I've always been sort of interested in.
Yeah, I think that, of course, is different for every office. I actually went to law school to become a public defender for the exact reason that you're talking about, because I had seen the injustices and I wanted to dismantle the system. I wanted to represent people and help them. And actually, in law school, I did a clerkship for the public defender's office in the county that I work in now. And it was during that I realized that if I really wanted to sort of dismantle the system, I had to be the one with the power. And that's why I became a prosecutor. And because of that philosophy and the way that I run this office, our public defense group in Chittenden County understands that I'm at least attempting, I'm doing my best to sort of figure out a new way and dismantle some of these systems. So we have a really great relationship. Of course, are we still adversarial, especially on some particular cases? Of course, I think that comes with the system. But overall, it's really it's a very cordial relationship in which we're just trying to find the best outcome for everybody. They also recognize that they represent one person and I represent everybody else, including that person. Most of these folks are also my constituents. So they certainly understand that we're not always going to agree, but we have a great relationship. There have been public defenders who have come here from other jurisdictions, whether in Vermont or Bronx, New York, or other areas, that have come in and clearly not understood that dynamic and come in pretty hot, and expecting that we were going to be this really adversarial and toxic back and forth. And we've had to sort of train them or teach them that that's not how we do things here. It's not how you get good outcomes for people. And they usually come around, but we have a great relationship with our defense bar.
Okay. And so the image that I'm getting from all of this is that you have the mind of a public defender and sort of the background of a public defender, the ideology in some ways, and be beyond all odds because of the power that you saw in being able to have the discretion of prosecutor. You were able to sort of get into that position. Can you speak to maybe how difficult it was to get in the position that you're now in? Because to my understanding, I would think that it would be incredibly difficult for someone that comes from a public defender background to become a prosecutor, because the idea that we have in the media is that the only people that win these sort of prosecutor positions are people that are incredibly tough on crime and that are about arrest. So how
Yeah.
difficult was it for you in your process of becoming state's attorney?
Well, I think the first sort of most important aspect is that I wasn't a prior public defender. Like I did a clerkship there, but right out of law school, I became a prosecutor. So I've only ever been a prosecutor. I just have the philosophy in mind of public defense. And I say that in a way that like I still believe wholeheartedly that my job, my sole job is public safety. I just view that a little differently than a lot of other prosecutors. So I lucked out in that about 6.5 years into being a deputy state's attorney, the state's attorney position became available. But because it was midterm when it became available, it was an appointment process by our governor. And so I was able to get the appointment without having to go through an election. That in itself was a whole process because I was going against some people who were very politically entrenched, and there was other dynamics involved there. But I was able to go through that without an election, and then I was elected in 2000, like 2 years later, without a whole lot of sort of attention around the work I was doing. This past election that I just had in August was a contested primary and was pretty awful. A lot of this stuff came up. The rhetoric around it was really gross. It got a lot of right wing, kind of conservative rhetoric, a lot of dog whistling, a lot of disinformation in the community in an attempt to get me out of this position. And I won the primary like overwhelmingly by like 22 points, and I won in every single district in the county. And so I think that is sort of a growing trend around the country where folks in communities are recognizing that what we're doing isn't working and that we really need to be looking at this in different ways. What you said is certainly historically the case, that public defenders aren't usually the folks that are looking to run for these positions, and they're not usually the people that are winning. But that's actually changed in the last like 5 years, where now there's a growing trend of public defenders or civil rights attorneys running against incumbent district attorneys and winning very often, and then winning re-election as well. So Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Fox in Chicago, Kim Gardner, Chesa Boudin, despite what ended up happening, was a public defender running in San Francisco, George Gascon, and so many others around the country that have that background and are winning because they're telling their communities, the system is racist, the system is classist, we need to do better. And by doing better, we will actually make all of us more safe. And that's not only evidence-based and data-driven, which is of course super helpful, but for a lot of folks in the communities, they know that that's true and are just looking for a way to be a part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is propelling a lot of these huge victories? Do you think these turnouts come out mostly from perhaps in your jurisdiction, college students that are very interested in getting involved in the system, maybe after 2020 and George Floyd and BLM and stuff? Or do you see an older generation coming around? What are the sort of demographics of maybe your voters?
It's a really good question. I actually was a little worried about my primary because it was during the summer. And so the college population wasn't here. And I do think that the college population understands these issues in a way, like that generation just understands these issues far better than the older generations, or even some people in my generation. So I think had it been during school, that would have been a huge turnout, but it wasn't, and I still won by 21 points. So that tells me that there is a large population, especially to have this be a primary in Vermont in the summer. The expectation was a very low turnout in general, which is always concerning. But we also had a really hotly contested congressional seat open, which we haven't had in a very, very long time due to Senator Patrick Leahy's retirement. And we've never sent a woman to Congress, and we had 3 phenomenal women running. And so, and one of them was a pretty progressive platform. And so I think that that also helped because there was like this kind of wave of progressive women running against like some somewhat conservative Democrats. And so our primaries in Vermont are really our election. And so I think a lot of people were really interested in being vocal about which way our state was going to go, both federally and on these local levels. I also think it helped that there, was it was right after Roe v. Wade is getting overturned. And I think that there was just an interest in electing more women. And my opponent was, an older white male. And so I think that for some people, yes, it's about these issues, but it's also about like identity and who we want representing us as a state and who we are kind of sick of hearing from,
Right.
frankly. And those were the options in a lot of elections around the state. So I think that that helped.
Right. I think a lot of people, me included, are just coming to understand sort of the idea of public safety and these platforms and the data that
Yeah.
propels these platforms and makes a lot of them true. Sort of, what can you tell me about the idea of public safety and restorative justice, specifically as it relates to what you do in your office?
Yeah, so I mean, I am a huge advocate for restorative justice in all phases of our system. So whether that be pre-charge, in lieu of prosecution, or while a case is pending, or post disposition as part of supervision, I think that restorative justice should always play a role in our cases. What I have found as a prosecutor over the years is that when we talk to victims of crime, we ask them like, what do you need, to feel whole, or what can we do for you? um so often the answer is like, I just want them to apologize, or I just want them to take responsibility, or I just want them to say they're sorry, and I just want to know this isn't going to happen to somebody else, or I want to know why they did it to me. Those types of questions, which our criminal legal system as it's designed doesn't allow for. And in fact is the opposite, right? Like we teach people from such a young age that if you do something wrong or you get in trouble, like don't talk to the cops, don't admit that you did anything, don't talk to the victim. Then they get charged with a crime and they come in, and we, the state, say, you can't talk to this victim. And then their defense attorney says, we're going to get you out of this. Like, don't make any admissions. And then we have a change of plea. And at best, the person has to say whether they're guilty or not. There's no opportunity for any of what most victims want. So, and most of them want that in lieu of a conviction. They don't care about a conviction. They just want to know that this isn't going to happen again. So restorative justice practices give them all of that. And it can be with a conviction or it can be without one, but it does allow for a person responsible for creating harm or committing harm to apologize and take responsibility, which I think is like true accountability without punishment. um, I think often of like our criminal legal system as it's currently designed. When you think about doing something wrong when you're younger and you get in trouble and your parents punish you, right? And they like send you to your room or you get grounded. For me, like that would happen and I would just stew and I would get angrier and I was more likely to do it again. And I would blame my parents and I would say, this isn't my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. That's like our criminal legal system versus your parents being like, I'm really disappointed in you. Like, and me having to be like, like, okay, I'm sorry. I won't do it again. I don't want you to be disappointed in me. This is why I did it. Like, that's restorative justice. And from, at least from my perspective, that aspect, that like taking accountability is far more likely to lead to you not creating further harm in the future. Um, so that's my way of like sort of explaining to folks why I think that, because that's something I think we can all relate to. Being grounded versus your parents being disappointed in you, like one is far worse than the other. And for me at least, it wasn't the grounding. So we just have so much work to do with regards to the legal system in terms of like what accountability really means, and do we want accountability or do we want punishment? Because they're not the same thing. And too often we think that punishment is accountability, and that that will lead to less crime, which in fact it does the opposite. You know, further punishment, especially incarceration, is more likely to lead to further harm.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely think I definitely agree with a lot of the things you say 100%, but the sort of platform of restorative justice feels difficult in a lot of ways. It feels incredibly difficult, and sometimes it feels like an insurmountable task to change the legal system in
Yeah.
such a way. I mean, you could definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't our legal system go back all the way to England and the UK and sort of traditions of their own legal systems? And it seems as if we're trying to change something that's been so entrenched for hundreds of years. I just, it's hard for me to think of how possible enacting policies like restorative justice would be in huge cities like New York and LA. And I
Yeah.
just don't know how that would fare.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly, yes, a lot of our, kind of literal legal system might come from like European, um, colonization truly, but our punishment system, like in terms of how we punish folks, that is very much an American thing. Other countries don't police, prosecute, or incarcerate folks at nearly the number that we do. And American punishment is very much linked to American slavery, and
Mm.
that we outlaw slavery, but then really just make it something else, and that's our criminal legal system. We now just enslave them through Black and brown folks through jails, right, in cages versus shackles. That's like a very direct link that you can see. So that's actually not that old in comparison to like European colonization, of course. But I think that what's interesting is that other cities like New York, for example, she brought it up, Danielle Sered runs Common Justice in Brooklyn, which is one of the biggest restorative justice programs in the country, and it's incredibly successful. And they are working with populations that are committing really violent offenses, and mostly youth, not underage youth, but like 17 to like 25-year-olds, I think, is their sort of population. A lot of gun violence, a lot of really violent offenses. And those folks are not going to jail and are instead going through a restorative justice approach, and their recidivism rates are like next to nothing. If those same folks in other cities are going through the regular process, they are like 64% more likely to commit violent crime. And so in some ways, it's, again, if you really take the effort to look at the data and the research and the outcomes, it's more mind-boggling that cities aren't doing it. If they really want to address crime and public safety in their communities, they should be doing more restorative justice work, because the outcomes are far, like, not even close, like far better than the typical legal system outcomes. But
Right.
you're right. I mean, there's a lot of power involved in the legal system. There's a lot of money involved in the current legal system. So incarcerating people makes a lot of people a lot of money. And so that's like the actual issue to get by. It's not necessarily changing the minds of the people in communities. It's taking power and money from the people at the top, which is why I think more communities are electing folks who say that they're going to do something about it, because the people at the top aren't going to do that unless they're changing who's in charge.
Hmm. Do you have any insights about the political process for becoming these district attorneys? Because it seems as if it's so incredibly easy to just sort of stack up political points by appealing to the anxieties within all of us and saying that the easiest thing to say is that these people are committing crimes. I'm going to get these people off of the streets.
Yep.
Sometimes I wonder how how do we on the side of restorative justice sort of make restorative justice more appealing to a voting demographic that may not be the type of person that knows everything about the data and things like that, but these are people that maybe just don't know, and how do we convince them?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a great answer for that, because that was most of my campaign that I just had, was like
Yeah.
countering the disinformation being pushed by my opponent and his supporters. And a lot of it was around restorative justice. And it was a constant battle for me to, one, just defend my record and like make sure that what they were saying, that people actually had the truth about what my office does or doesn't do with regards to restorative justice. But also, rather than just getting defensive and being like, we don't do that, we don't do that, also being like, but restorative justice is not the problem here. And like, these are the numbers regarding restorative justice practices. These are a couple of victims who have gone through that process that were really thrilled with the outcomes. Getting victims to talk about their experience, I think, is really important. Having it come from real people and real stories versus from politicians running for office is always better. So engaging with community members to try to get their voices out there. But that can also be hard, because some folks, like, they shouldn't have to share their very personal experiences and the harm that was either committed against them or that they committed just for political points too. So there's a really delicate balance there. But I think that overall, again, I know that I'm can only speak for my community, but they saw through it. Ultimately, whatever we did, which was usually to talk about the the actual facts, um, I did a sort of series on my social media pages called Get Curious with Sarah George. And one of them was specifically around restorative justice, to say, like, if you hear that it's just a slap on the wrist, these are the facts. And it was like a minute long. But I had a lot of people reaching out after to say that, like, that 1 minute was enough for them to recognize that this rhetoric is not accurate and is actually really harmful. So I think people want to know. They want to know the truth. They can sort of recognize when they're being used and taken advantage of. Obviously, there's always going to be a population that just doesn't take that extra minute to educate themselves. Um, I don't know that there's a lot you can do for that. You just have to do your best to get the right information out there and hope people take the time to look into it.
Yeah. So what is the direction that you see the country going in your sort of most ideal sense of it, in terms of prosecution? What's the ideal world for you look like?
I mean, an ideal world, I tell my staff all the time that we should be constantly working to put ourselves out of work, right? Like, we, the ideal world is to have communities who are safe and have elected officials who are lifting up people over systems. Um, I think that we have so far to go, but I really do feel optimistic that we have more and more communities around the country that are recognizing that, even amidst a pandemic, a global pandemic, where more people are suffering in our communities than ever before, maybe not ever before, but certainly in our near history, um, they're still recognizing that police and prosecutors aren't the answer, that jails aren't the answer, that we need to be investing in mental health services and substance use services and housing and healthcare and childcare, that those are the ways we make our communities more safe, not police and prosecutors. So I think just continuing to push that message, we will get there. Hopefully, in our lifetime, but I think this might be our children's, hopefully our children's future, if not ours. But we're getting there. And one thing I would just point out, which I feel optimistic about, there is a group of sort of quote unquote progressive prosecutors around the country, like myself, and that group is growing. Like, we used to have like 8 of us around a table, and now there's too many often to bring everybody in one at one time, which is a really great thing. And amongst us, we represent about 26% of the country. So if you think about it that way, that like progressive prosecutors represent a quarter of this country's population, that's actually really optimistic. And that's in cities like Chicago and Philadelphia and Brooklyn and Manhattan and um, Los Angeles, Orlando, like all like really big jurisdictions. So that's really exciting, and it gives me some hope that we have a lot of work to do, but we are making progress.
Amazing. Well, that gives me a lot to think about, and just the idea of progressive prosecution and the huge movement that is taking place in our country, bigger than I even knew. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
And I know a lot of people, like, they hear that term, and if you're like an abolitionist and the term progressive prosecution is almost like an oxymoron.
Mhm.
Um, I get that, and I don't want to minimize that. But what I would say in response to that is the alternative is regular prosecution, which
Right.
is far worse. So like, do most of us as progressive prosecutors wish you didn't need any of us? Absolutely. But in the meantime, while we dismantle this system, we need people like us in these positions. And so my hope would be that people understand that yes, this might be the ideal down the road, but right now we're working with what we've got, and we have to support people with this philosophy and vision.
Right. Prosecution in the ideal world doesn't exist at all,
Right.
but we are on the train to get there.
Yes,
Get there, and
exactly.
you are part of the change.
Yeah,
But yeah, thank you so much for talking to me, Sarah George, and it's been a pleasure.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.